Whenever you're studying a text, it is always in your best interest to ensure that you have your own interpretation and that you are building upon that with the interpretation from your teacher, from those other people in your class, and from anyone else who can provide what they thought about your same text. In light of that, today's video is about 6 quotes from Sunset Boulevard that I think we can take a little bit further. 6 quotes that we can consider in a range of different ways in order to deepen our understanding. There's probably about another 600 quotes that we could find from this film. It's full of really, really great ones. But the idea about these 6 that I've chosen today is that they are all able to be seen in many different ways, and they might just provide you with some new ways of understanding this film and deepen your overall knowledge and appreciation of it. We're going to dive in with our first one here. I didn't argue with her. You don't yell at a sleepwalker. And of course, that quote, sleepwalker, we could use that as a single word quote when we're describing Norma Desmond. This idea of what is inherent in that description of someone being a sleepwalker, someone who is oblivious to what is going on around them, someone who is not really all there in the real world, someone who is not encountering a reality that exists all around them. Of course, the other part of this, rather than just considering that very one-dimensional way of saying, oh, it's a great way of summing up who Norma is. If someone is to be seen as a sleepwalker, those that are seeing her, and when it says you don't wake a sleepwalker, there's this idea that there are people who are living in the real world, people who are conscious to these things, people who are viewing and seeing someone like Norma in the way that she's going about their life, but choosing not to bring her back to reality. It's a very interesting line too when we take it further than just this idea of, oh, okay, yeah, it's a great way of understanding that Norma isn't really attached to reality. When we think about the fact that Joe's advice is you don't wake a sleepwalker. This idea of, well, it would be the wrong thing to do to bring her to this reality. And of course, by the end of the film, we know that his attitude towards that changes. This next quote is a very short exchange between Betty and Joe when they're walking through the Paramount lot. And when she jokingly looks at him and says, "Don't you sometimes hate yourself?" And his reply is a single word, "constantly." Now, the power behind this quote is that it gives us this deeper insight and a way in which we can understand Joe at perhaps a deeper level. Of course, he is very quick-witted, very intelligent, very humorous, and this flirtatious sort of back and forth that he has with Betty as they're writing their script together brings out these qualities in him. And as a part of him making this joke, it speaks to this deeper malaise that exists within him, that when we really consider it, you know, it's again one of those things that is said in jest, but of course there's an element of truth to that. This idea of him hating himself, this self-loathing, this lack of, trust in himself, this lack of belief, lack of self-esteem. And when we open that up, it really speaks to who he might be, and we can open up our understanding of him as a character, and we start to think about, well, if we do think about Joe as a character that lacks self-esteem, that doesn't, have a lot of love for himself or belief in himself, all of a sudden, these other things that have been happening since the beginning of the film start to take on another element to them. The idea of his desperation to, of course, go and live with Norma, and how that quickly changes in terms of, who's playing who and all of these types of things, can lead us to, appreciate who he might be and what's really fueling his actions throughout the film. A really great way of seeing it, because if you're anything like me, the first time that you viewed the film, you probably saw him as, the leading Hollywood man. He's quick-witted, the way that he speaks to people. He's obviously intelligent, and we see him as someone who's a little bit down on his luck. But when we really consider it, there might just be that little bit more to it that can really open up our understanding of that character. The next quote we're going to go to is a description of Norma Desmond's house the first time that Joe lays eyes on it. And as we read through this and as we hear this for the first time when we're watching the film, it's of course very much apt when it comes to the description of what we're seeing in Norma's mansion and what's become of it, this decrepit old place that it is. But of course, as with most quotes and most lines from this film, there's so much more going on underneath it. And Joe says, "The whole place seemed to have been stricken with a kind of creeping paralysis, out of beat with the rest of the world, crumbling apart, in slow motion. And when we take a look at that, what we're really getting to here is Wilder's ideas about death, about ending, about obsolescence. And that doesn't just have to be when we're talking about people, of course. We're talking about, the silent film era. This is a Hollywood of yesteryear. This is someone who has been left behind. We have so many other quotes, Norma, the audience left 20 years ago, and all these types of things. We have this understanding that actually what Wilder's trying to get us to think about here is this idea of that life moves in cycles, and that things within our lives move within cycles, and that there are some who can adapt. If we think about DeMille and the way that he was there when Norma was a star, and then that he is still a relevant figure in Hollywood, and there are some that get completely left behind by it. So when we have a think about this, we start to open up our understanding about what this film might be saying about endings and things being obsolete, and we start to consider what Wilder might be saying about that. There's some fantastic smaller quotes within this: creeping paralysis, being out of beat with the rest of the world, and we can really consider what the film might be saying to us about how the world moves on, and how the world, particularly the world of Hollywood, can actually be quite a brutal place in that it is constantly moving, constantly evolving, and those who can't adapt get chewed up and spat out pretty quick. In line with that, this next quote from Betty is a really fantastic view into Hollywood itself. If we take a look at this film and think about, okay, it's a Hollywood film about Hollywood, we start to think about who it might be criticising and what it might be criticising about, the world of films and how these things came about in the mid part of the 20th century. And Betty Schaefer says to us, "I had 10 years of dramatic lessons, diction, dancing. Then the studio made a test. Well, they didn't like my nose, slanted this way a little. So I went to a doctor and had it fixed. They made more tests, and they were crazy about my nose, only they didn't like my acting." And so this idea of Betty having to change who she was physically to please these people, the people at the studios, the audience, whoever it might be, speaks again to this sort of brutal nature of Hollywood, in that it is, chewing people up and spitting them out, as we mentioned in the last quote, that it will take a person, it will consume them, it will take everything from them in order to get what it needs from them. And that we have this experience, of course, when we see Norma, we have this tale of someone who was at the height of her powers, and now where we see her and how far she has fallen, and how she has been forgotten by the system that built her up to believe that she was, so important, to now we have someone in Betty who has actually been able to avoid that by the virtue of the fact that, she wasn't liked by the audience or by the studios. When we consider Joe as a part of this idea as well, we can really start to think about what Wilder might be saying about Hollywood and the people within it. When we talk about him being a successful screenwriter, he mentions, that was last year. This year I've got bills to pay. When we consider all these things and put all of this together, we can actually start to build a picture of what Wilder might be saying about Hollywood and the people within it, when we really consider that outside of a select few, not many people that are involved in this Hollywood studio system are very content or very happy. Instead, rather, what we see is that many of them have been used, many of them have been, completely left to their own devices, and many of them are desperate for whatever it was that they once had. A great idea for you to consider on subsequent viewings of this film is the idea of what is genuine and what is artificial. This idea of things being fake. And one of the great insights that we get to that is the walking through the Paramount studio lot with Betty and with Joe. And as is said during that scene, look at this street, all cardboard, all hollow, all phony, all done with mirrors. Many, many great quotes within that one line. Okay, this idea of things being phony, hollow, cardboard, all done with mirrors. That word phony is used later when Joe is talking about the fact that, he should have known that she would see through his phony act and all these types of things. So we can take that out further and start to think about people and who they really are. And we see this with Joe in particular, in the way in which he must come to terms with who he really is, and he doesn't like who he's become by the end of this film, but he does have that redeeming scene in when he decides, no, I'm not going to lead Betty into this web of lies that I've constructed. I'm not going to, be manipulated by Norma anymore, and realizes that he must be true to himself. When we take a look at it, we can ask ourselves how many things in this film have been constructed as a fake reality, as a way of people, living in these ingenuine, artificial worlds. The world that Max creates for Norma, again, a fantastic way of us understanding this idea further. And when we ask that question about what's real, what's genuine, and what's authentic in this film versus what isn't, we can really start to open up as to what this film might be getting to in regards to that idea. I'm going to finish today's video with a fantastic quote from Joe when he says, "It wasn't until I got back to that peculiar prison of mine that I started facing the facts." And when we think about that idea of facing the facts, we can take that out to other characters as well. We've talked a lot today about reality and about, people not being able to face up to reality. So right here, we have a very, very clear quote when it talks about facing the facts. Think about what that might mean. Think about the realities that people might need to actually confront and what keeps them from actually confronting them. Because, of course, the easy thing to do with this is just consider Norma. And, of course, there's millions of things we could say about her not being able to face the facts about the reality of her own life. But when we start to take that out further and start thinking about Max and why he might have constructed the world in which he has, is it a purely selfless act, all for Norma, or is it something that he needs from that world to be able to be that person and who he was, way back when? When we think about Joe as well, of course, who is the person who actually says this, we realise that perhaps one of the prevailing messages of this film is that we can only construct a fake reality for so long. We can only try to fool ourselves and fool others for so long, and that ultimately there must come a time where we, quote, face the facts, where we confront the reality of the situation we're living in. And of course, the tragedy of the film, and the way that we know that it ends, because we're told right from the start, is that the moment that Joe has that redeeming scene and when he comes to, face up to who he is and take accountability for his actions, of course, his life is cut short by Norma, who can't get herself to do the same thing. Really interesting idea if you think about it and start asking yourself about the different characters, how they move through the film, what it is that they can't face up to, what it is that they haven't been able to face up to and accept. Those characters that have been able to accept that, perhaps characters like Betty, who have been able to accept, things in their life and accept the reality and move on, and those that are either at one extreme like Norma or those who come to accept like Joe. Really interesting way of thinking about it. Guys, thank you very much for watching today's video. I hope that you've got plenty from it. If there's anything that you'd like to clarify, please make sure you ask down in the comments. Check out the rest of our channel for other VCE English videos. Be more than happy to help you out if you've got any questions or anything else that you'd like to add to these. Perhaps some quotes that you can't believe I didn't include in this list. I'd love to hear from you. But until we see you again in another video, hopefully another one on Sunset Boulevard that'll be coming up soon. All the best with your studies and good luck.